The manhwa begins with the announcement of the crown prince's presence, the rightful heir of the Holy Blood Cross, master of the Light Dragon and protector of the Ireia Empire, Prince Caesar. Upon his arrival, murmurs fill the room. How can such a beautiful man be cursed? I hear he completely suppressed the dragon's blood. However, he completely ignores their whispers instead. He turns to Rin and asks about his consort, and he responds that the princess consort will be entering shortly. Shortly after, the presence of the princess consort is announced, but the look on the prince's face is filled with shock. For 2 years, what kept him going through the tough and grueling war was Len. It was all for her. His eyes sparkle with hope at the thought of him being able to see her again. However, upon her arrival, his smile fades. Instead, a lady with golden hair stood with a smile congratulating him on his victory. He doesn't waste any time and asks where his consort is, but the lady tries to play it off. She goes to him with a smile and asks what he's talking about, pointing out that it's her, Giovanetta. However, he pulls away, immediately reaches for his sword, and then declares afterward, "I'll ask one last time, where is Ireia?" The outcast of the house Flores, a bastard who did menial chores like a servant, even her leg was lame and she limped. And the cursed first prince of the Ireia Empire, the noblest and lowliest of the royal palace. The curse of the Light Dragon, inherited through royal blood, turned the once radiant prince into a monster. The lame bastard of the ducal house and the cursed prince, a perfectly fitting match between two family outcasts. But even so, she was happy, so happy she wanted nothing more. But was it greedy to wish that happiness could last forever? On that night, she stood with the feeling of betrayal as she asked with an unsteady voice if he's really going. But why? You know you wouldn't come back if you go, she thought, but he didn't think the same. That night she clung to him in tears, pleading for him not to go, mentioning he'll die if he goes, but his mind was already made and he only assured her he'll come back no matter what. You who clung to me like I was your only safe haven in the whole world, abandoned me and left me the minute the curse was lifted and you were made whole. For 2 years, I wore letters every single day, but never received a reply. Rumors of an affair between my half-sister and Caesar spread through the secluded palace, and then she listened to her sister rub it in her face how the man she'd been sending letters to for 2 years without any response, confessed that he loved her, and her sister demeaned her by saying it was never a position she deserved in the first place, so everything's just going back to how it should be. After the curse was broken, did the shame of marrying a shabby woman like me become too much for him to bear? If I had known it would end like this, I should have just stayed broken. Her carriage suddenly stops. She asks what is going on, and the guard with her informs her they are under attack. Again she asks who it could possibly be and pleads with him to remain there with her, but he informs her he'll go check outside, but only his blood makes it back to her. Now a question lingers in her mind, is it bandits targeting the crown prince, or is someone after me? She protests her fate, she can't die like that, at least not that way. She rushes out of the carriage in an attempt to escape, however once they notice her escape attempt, they go after her. As she flees, a conversation lingers in her head. The one who survives is the one who wins, but, in this hopeless situation, what can I even do? At that moment, a man appears on a horse and slays all the men after her. She turns her head when she notices a shadow that isn't hers casting over her. He steps off his horse while she immediately reaches for her dagger, and as she holds it in front, she warns him not to come any closer. She strains her eyes trying to figure out who it could possibly be, the person in the armor, but once her vision is clear and she notices his dark hair. Her gaze softens as she calls to confirm if it's who she really thinks it is, Caesar? She struggles to steady her voice as she demands to know why he's there, and faced with his silence, the realization hits her. Ah, I see now, you came to witness my end. Now that you're perfect, I'm the only stain left on you. 3 years ago, she sat as a bride listening to each statement laced with mockery. They say a bride who marries on a rainy day is destined for many tears. How many days will this one survive? It'll be a miracle if she survives the day without anything happening. It can't be helped. After all, her groom is that monster prince. I've always wondered if it was going to be like this. Why they brought me here in the first place. She was born as an illegitimate child of the Flores ducal family and wandered the streets with her birth mother until she was 7, when she got adopted. They told her mother Annalisa later died of a plague on the streets and her position in the ducal household was always close to the bottom. Lower than the mansion servants or staff, perhaps even lower than the horses of hunting dogs kept at the estate, the very bottom. Then one day, she was informed that she's been selected as the first prince, Caesar's marriage partner. She was told the Flores family has traditionally produced empresses and now, it was just her turn. And only then did she realize why they brought her, someone they considered an eyesore, into the mansion. It was all for the sake of this engagement. The eldest daughter Giovanetta wasn't even engaged yet, but they slipped her and offered her, the second daughter and an illegitimate child, but she knew it too well. It was all because the first Prince Caesar is the cursed prince. The first prince has been sickly since childhood and barely appeared at official events, and also he was the illegitimate child of the former Empress Adelaide, who suffered from madness after childbirth before eventually taking her own life. The monster prince, that epithet had always followed the first prince. Finding a consort for the alleged cursed prince was a difficult task, since noble families who heard the rumors tried to avoid marriage negotiations with the prince by quickly arranging marriages for their beloved daughters or adopting children with no connections. The imperial family searched for suitable matches and exchanged marriage proposals 4 times, but despite the efforts, none of the marriages came to fruition because all the young ladies involved in the negotiations died. In the present day she stands in front of her family, her heart heavy as she settles with the realization that is why they brought her there. For the first time she speaks, she asks if she's to become the crown prince's consort, and the lady of House Flores responds with a yes. She retorts that a street urchin like her becoming a princess consort is such a great opportunity. The curse of death for the young ladies involved in the marriage negotiations was never officially determined, but everyone whispered that it was due to the curse placed on the prince. Standing in the middle of the room, she grips onto her dress tightly as she thinks, a marriage arrangement with such a prince is basically telling me to go die. She continues and tells her she will become the most noble woman in the empire, remarking that it's an unparalleled honor, but her thoughts linger. What sly words, urging me to drink from a poisoned chalice, but I have no other choice but to drink from this poison. If this is to be my fate, she accepts the proposal. She declared that she'll marry the prince with her lips curled into a tight reluctant smile at the hope. A fleeting reversal of status, how could I refuse such a noble position? So this is my choice. I will become the prince's consort. All of this is clearly my decision, even if it leads to a path that consumes my flesh and ends in death. In a new scene, she sits dressed in her wedding attire, alone with her thoughts. She's aware the prince rarely showed himself in public, but what she never imagined is that she'd be conducting the wedding with a proxy. She hears a sound come from the other side of the room and immediately turns her head, then she realizes they're here. She flinches at the sight of the knight covered fully in armor and with chains. With unsteady voice she manages to voice her question. What is this? To her surprise she's informed that the man in the cage is the Crown Prince Caesar. He continues and informs her they've given him a sedative so he's unconscious. They unchain him and place him on the bed, and afterwards he attempts to take his leave, however she chases after them. Through the little space left before he shuts the door, he informs her the effects of the drugs are wearing off, so he'll wake up soon. She goes back to the bed wondering what she's supposed to do. No matter how she looks at it, even if he's cursed, she thinks to treat a nation's prince and the first in line for succession at that, like an animal. She goes closer and suddenly freezes upon closer inspection. He appears no different from an ordinary person on the outside. However, her resolve shifts and she freezes in terror as she questions, "What is that?" The prince, who's been lying asleep, fingers suddenly twitch and without warning, he jolts upright with a low growl. He clutches his head, groaning in pain, and in a frenzy, he lashes out, destroying everything in his path, while Len sits in a corner hiding from him, trying to stop herself from making any sound that could attract his attention. Still in hiding, she can only question what kind of power that could possibly be. Then after a while she notices the noises have stopped. She looks out to see if maybe the anesthetic was still effective, but she goes pale once she notices the prince behind her, his eyes blood red, glaring at her emotionless. In this minute of panic, all the harsh statements she had to endure replays in her head: how she was told she's going to die anyway, how she was gifted a dagger as a wedding gift by her half-sister with a remark, "Someone like you will just be a bite to him, shouldn't you at least have that?" And also a last piece of advice: if I were to be married off and ravaged by a monster, I'd rather kill myself with that. Tears pours down her face as she admits to herself she knows it too, that she's already a discarded card. It was only a matter of whether she dies by her own hand or by die at the hands of the monster in front of her. She recalls her sister's last advice and thinks, but Giovanetta, there's something you don't know. I've never once given up on life, I've always struggled to survive, so this sword will never turn towards me. In the end, the one who survives is the strong one. She warns him not to come any closer, but she's left speechless by his response. Gee. Go away? She boldly says yes, continuing with her threat, but just as she warns him against coming any closer, he appears in her face, with the dagger just a few meters away from his eyes. With a mix of terror and panic, she demands to know what he's doing, noting that he's really going to stab himself, but then she goes quiet. His pain returns the next minute, and in an instant he drops to the floor, clutching his head in his palm in agony. She was wondering why he was acting that way, but then a realization hit her. He's terrified. But of what exactly? She looks outside the window thinking there's no way it could be what she's thinking. Then she summons up her courage and finally asks, "Are you scared of thunder?" He pauses his movements, and once he raises his head to look at her, she notices the tears in his eyes. Strange, a man rumored to be a monster is trembling like this just from thunder? But if I'm not mistaken, this man isn't a monster. He's just a frightened beast. She gently consoles him, stating the sound is loud but it wouldn't hurt them, nothing's going to happen. He hears the sound of the thunder again and goes into another frenzy. As he growls in pain, she yells for him to calm down, but then she notices it in the corner of her eyes, the dagger. However, just as she's about to grab it, he grabs her hand and pushes her down backwards. He lets out a loud growl as he settles above her, while her eyes widen the moment she realizes his form has changed. She protests, her voice trembling as she begs him to let go, but he doesn't. Instead, he pulls her hand toward his mouth. Her heart pounds as she squeezes her eyes shut, bracing for the pain, convinced he's about to bite down and devour her. But then, nothing, just a slow, unexpected warmth spreading across her skin. And what she sees makes her freeze, her wound, he's licking it. He presses his teeth into her palm while she winces in pain, and after a while she notices he's gone back to normal. Looking at him docile again, she wonders why. Don't tell me after drinking my blood? This is less like a monster and more like a large beast. Later, he lays on her lap sound asleep. She softly caresses his face as she thinks to fall asleep so soundly after doing something like that. He did act strangely, but it didn't seem like he was trying to harm me. Perhaps, is he in a similar situation to me? But what's most important is that I survived like this. The next morning outside the Crown Prince's room, one of the knights grumble, "To think I have to clean up corpses again." He wonders how much longer he'll rampage this time, warning the others to brace themselves since they might end up getting bitten like last time, but little do they know they're in for a fun surprise. A knight immediately stops, visibly shocked at the sight in front of him, the prince sleeping soundly and the lady signaling for them to be quiet. A knight loses his composure and drops his sword, suddenly causing the prince to reawaken. The prince almost goes on another rampage, but luckily Ireia stops him just in time. She throws her arm around his neck, asking him not to do that. He takes her hand, then he turns to her slowly and asks softly, "Don't do that?" With a smile she says, "Yes, you shouldn't do that." She tells him she will absolutely not watch him get hurt and asks if he'll stay still, and he accepts. The knights on the other hand watch in disbelief, questioning what is happening. Then a knight orders that they immediately inform the emperor of it. In a new scene, a maid reports the news circulating the palace, that the first prince and his bride successfully completed their first night together. The bride had only a scratch, but she didn't die, neither was she seriously injured. The lady questions with pure disdain, "That thing survived?" While the maids can only helplessly say yes. "Interesting, very interesting," the Empress Cornelia remarks. Cornelia, she was Emperor Guido's longtime mistress since his days as crown prince, a woman who only obtained the position as empress after the first prince's mother, the former empress, died young. Her son, the second Prince Matthias, was also born an illegitimate child when she was still a mistress, and it took over 20 years for him to be recognized as a royal grandson. The maid humbly questions what should be done about the young lady, while the empress responds with a smirk. Now that they're formally married, they'll need a palace to reside in. She orders the maid to grant them to Beryl Palace. She asks for her name and her maid informs her it is Ireia. So many of them die, it's quite confusing, you know. How long will this one last? Who knows? This time that thing might even take my place. Her lips curl into a smirk as she orders, "Tell that thing I'd like to have tea with her soon." In a new scene, a priest exclaims excitedly, gently remarking that it's a miracle. He continues and says to think she's actually alive. As expected, the descendant of Florus is different. While she stands there barely showing any emotion on her face as she realizes it seemed everyone really expected that she would die, but even she thought so. She turns her head and notices the sheet stained with blood from the previous night and carefully considers. The proof of marriage remains. Now, no one can deny the validity of this marriage. At least I can feel at ease for now. However, later she stands shocked as she faces the desolate palace the empress supposedly prepared for them. The maid tries to explain how everything happened so suddenly, then she takes a break before asking if perhaps she doesn't like the residence. After a brief moment of silence between the two of them, her lips curl into a smirk as she says, "No, I like it." She also asks her to pass on her gratitude to Her Majesty the Empress for her care in many ways. Later she drops onto the bed tired. She recalls the maid's question and thinks, even though it's the imperial palace, there's nothing particularly special there, but if she were to be honest, compared to her she was treated in the Flores household, that is nothing. Suddenly, a maid appears and informs her she'll help her with her bath. However, she refuses and orders that from then on, there will be no need to assist her with bathing. Later, she sits at the dinner table. She asks where the prince is and the maid tells her he should arrive soon. She continues and informs her that she and the prince will reside there together in the green malachite palace. But she can only think, even if he's considered a cursed prince, he's still a royal of this nation. At the very least, as long as Caesar is with me, he'll be my backing. She snaps out of her thoughts when she hears the announcement of the princess' entry. Her expression brightens as she calls him name, but she stops halfway and her face goes pale, terror evident as she sees the prince brought in like an animal. Immediately she springs up demanding to know how they can treat a person like that. Rather, they just warn her to step back or she'll get bitten. The prince snaps the chains binding his hands while the knight orders everyone to step back. He orders them to hold him down before he goes wild, while a knight holds Ireia, who orders them to stop while constantly tries to go to him. The prince tries to get rid of the muzzle, however his attempts are to no avail and eventually he falls to the ground already worn out. The knights take advantage of this opportunity to restrain him again while Ireia just stands watching the horror unfold, unable to do anything to stop it. How can they do this kind of thing? She turns her head to the knights, who suggest she doesn't touch the muzzle or chains if she values her fingers. Lastly, he passes her an item before taking his leave. With the new silence in the room, she goes to him, shaking as she questions. "What is this really?" She watches him more closely and notices, just that morning he didn't have those kinds of wounds. "And what's with the muzzle?" She wonders how he's supposed to eat in that condition, but then she notices something in the corner, sliced raw meat and tongs. A chill spreads through her body as she pictures it. Do these people really think of Caesar as less than an animal? This is just like the treatment I endured back in the Flores manor, no, even worse. His low groan snaps her out of her thoughts, and with a strong resolve she assures him she'll release him right that moment. She recalls the knight's warnings, that she shouldn't touch the muzzle or chains, if she values her fingers, but she doesn't accept it. Even so, she thinks, you can't treat someone like that. She calls his name, and as she places her hand softly on the muzzle she informs him she'll take it off now. He struggles, but she doesn't give up on him. Instead, she gently comforts him until she finally takes it off. Looking at him with a warm expression, she retorts, "See? It's okay." But he suddenly goes into a frenzy again. She asks him what's wrong, and then she notices his form changing. The chains are nothing compared to his strength in his new form, so they easily snap. Her voice cracks as she calls his name. Then again she recalls the warnings and also how he handed her a little vial and asked her to throw the bottle towards the prince's face if something ended up going wrong. She immediately pulls it out, clutching it in her hands as she calls his name, trembling. Caesar had nearly calmed when he saw the vial in her hands, but the sight immediately brought back the memory of the knight's brutal treatments, prompting him to let out a low growl. Although terrified, she gently comforts him. However, he swings at her. Facing Caesar, who's not in his right mind, it dawns on her and she ponders, if I do something like this, am I any different from those people earlier? She winces as a sharp jolt of pain shoots through her hand the moment she tries to move it. Then she gets another idea. Come to think of it, a similar thing happened last night. But I quickly regained my senses. I can't be sure, though. Still, it's a gamble worth taking. She extends her hand to him, asking if he wants that. She tells him she'll give it to him, and in an instant, he rushes to her. She groans softly while he continues devouring her blood. A few moments go by and then she ponders. So he really calms down through blood? Thank goodness no one's here. A prince rumored to be cursed, now even craves blood. If someone finds about this, who knows what they'll say. She pulls away from him, asking him to stop now, but then she pauses when she notices something and calls carefully. Caesar? He grabs tightly into her, refusing to let go. She asks him what he's doing, even wondering if he could still be bloodthirsty, as she pleads with him to stop. He pushes her down onto the bed and proceeds to lick her neck with tongue. He traces his tongue along her body, all the way down to her collarbone, while she calls his name with red cheeks, asking him to stop. But it's to no avail, and she lays back with this weird feeling that something's off. Finally, with her last attempt, she cries out, "Stop, just stop it, please." This time he raises his head and asks, "Stop?" With tears already pouring down her eyes, she says yes and adds that if he keeps devouring her that way, she might die. His lips slowly part as he admits, "I don't want that." Then she also admits she doesn't want to kill him either, so. However, unexpectedly he reaches for her face as he wipes the tears off her cheek. Again he tells her he doesn't want that, although this time his expression darkens with sorrow. Looking at him, she wonders if he really understands what death is, but she doesn't dwell on that. Instead she thinks, at the very least, he doesn't want me to die. "Caesar, my name is Ireia. Annalisa used to call me Ren. Ren," he says with a smile. His unexpected smile caught her a bit off guard, and then she smiled herself and informed him they're now married. She reflects on how no one thought she'd survive the marriage, the maids who cursed her expecting her death, the rundown green quartz palace they'll be living in, and the empress who disapproves of both she and Caesar. Caesar's current situation doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that he's the only one I can count on. She declares to Caesar that she's on his side, but he just stares in confusion. Then she explains that they're both on the same side. So she asks him to tell her if someone picks on him like before again, but he just asks, "Picks on me?" And she clarifies, "Yeah, like that night, I mean those old men, were being mean." She sticks out her pinky and asks him to make a promise to her. They connect their pinky and he says promise, then she asks if he understands and he says yeah, repeating the word promise again. In a new scene she informs Caesar he needs to eat using a fork. She tries to show him how to do it himself, by carefully demonstrating it, however in the end she ends up feeding him herself. Just as she's lost in his adorable antics, thinking it feels more like having a 5-year-old for a husband, a sudden sound at the door pulls her back to reality. An old lady walks in, her voice shakes as she calls in shock, Prince Caesar. He appears to know her also. Ireia asks for her identity and the old lady apologizes for her sudden appearance. Then she introduced herself as Mercedes Aronso, assigned to Prince Caesar. She reveals that she served the prince as his nurse for many years, and upon hearing that the two of them moved to Nokjasok Palace, she came there without even a moment to spare. She also shares that of late the prince has become quite sensitive, mentioning even the knights have resolved to medicine and force lately, and Ireia snaps and questions if she was aware of that, then how could she let it come to that? But almost immediately her expression softens as the old lady breaks into tears, disclosing she apologized. With her shaky hands she tells her she simply doesn't have enough strength to stop Her Majesty the Empress. Ireia falls silent as she ponders silently, if she once served as a close lady-in-waiting, then she must come from a noble house of great renown, and yet for someone like her to have her hands so worn out from labor, it must have been to protect Caesar, nothing more than a prince in name. The old lady suddenly asks her how she does that. Wiping her tears she reveals with a smile the prince has never listened to anyone before, mentioning how lately he even rejected the care of her. She asks just how she managed to calm him down, but she freezes. She knows she can't tell her she managed to calm him down with blood, questioning who even will believe that even if she was to tell. She's most certain that if words were to spread about her using some kind of wicked magic, people would accuse her of witchcraft. She witnessed a witch trial, the end of a witch back in the days where she wandered the streets. Once condemned, no matter how noble her blood is, she instantly became less than even a beggar. She was paraded through the domain all day, pelted with stones and a wooden cross bound to her back. And her body was set ablaze, burned slowly until she was dead. The only way to stone for a sin is to suffer for as long and terrible as possible. The nanny asks if she's okay due to her sudden silence, and she assures her it's nothing, thinking she has to cover that up no matter what. Caesar reaches for her by surprise, calling her name softly with a concerned expression. She wonders if he caught on to her worries and assures him she's all right, while the nanny watching suddenly bursts into a cheerful laugh as she hints, "Highness must really like you, that's a relief." Later at night, as she lays almost asleep in bed, she recalls the nanny informing her that there will be a tea party with Her Majesty, Cornelia, so she will have a lot to prepare tomorrow. She lays with her eyes wide open as she questions, tea party with Her Majesty? What will happen? Suddenly a hand jerks her foot and she screams in fear. She notices Caesar at her foot and asks what he's doing, but he doesn't say anything. Instead, he just smiles, his cheeks red as a soft chuckle escape his lips. She goes calm, then she tells him that scared her and suggests he should have gone to his room. She tries to ask how he came to her room, but she pauses mid-question once she realizes she can't kick him out either. The next minute she grabs the blanket and remarks that it's cold down there. She suggests he comes up there and he agrees. As they lay in bed together, she looks at him and thinks, since they're married, it's okay to use the same bed. Come here, we can have a good sleep, if we hug each other like this. He agrees with her, but she's at her limit, so she doesn't hear him whisper her name softly and stand up kiss her softly on her cheek. In a new scene, a man asks if she survived. The knight says yes and comments that he thought another corpse would appear. Those conservative old men are going to be thrilled, he finishes. The empire's second prince, Matthias de la Rosa. The conservative fundamentalists supported the first Prince Caesar's legitimacy despite his severe mental instability. Matthias concludes that in truth they must want a puppet emperor. After years of war against the demons, 3 allied powers came to dominate the continent. The humans' Acetria Empire, the elves' Hybrillium Forest, and the dwarves' Stoican Iron Union. The Emperor of Esetria must receive unanimous recognition from the rulers of these allied nations to be acknowledged as emperor. However, the other two monarchs with voting rights always desired an emperor who suited their own tastes. In the present day, the second prince asks what noble family the lucky bride is from, and the knight reports that she's from the house of Flores. With a light scoff, he asks if that isn't the house of the hero who hunted the light dragon. Could it be true that the blood of the great sage suppresses the dragon's blood? They actually gave their daughter to that half-wit? However, the knight leans in closer and whispers something into his ear which he later ponders on. She's illegitimate, not surprising. Are Cosimo's descendants really different? He snaps back to reality, and as he dresses he reveals he never had the hobby of watching a dying woman, stating if he had known she would survive, he would have attended the wedding. A light smile tugs at the corner of his lips as he remarks, "Well, we'll surely meet soon enough." In a new scene, some maids urge another to confess the truth that instant, about touching Her Highness' jewelry. But the maid with tears dropping down her face swears that it wasn't her. The maids all surround her trying to make her confess, but suddenly, she jerks up from the bed. She turns to Caesar, who's still asleep, with the feeling like she just had a bad dream. She pauses as observed him curiously, and then she retorts, "With your eyes closed like this, you really do look like a fine young noble." However, the noise coming from outside their room distracts her. She steps outside to find some maids gathered in front of her room so early in the morning. Instantly she demands to know what is going on, then a maid glances at the maid trembling on the ground with a smirk on her face. She reports to her, pointing towards the maid, that she touched her jewelry. The other maids pitch in, stating they'd seen it clearly, insisting she removes her at once, but instead she questions silently. "What is this insolence?" For the first time she speaks. She orders the maid of the empress to speak. The maid introduced herself as Elsa, the head maid there, while mocking her quietly. "What is with this attitude? I heard she's a low-born bastard from the streets." Then she reveals that morning while they were cleaning, Sarah witnessed Delphina, the maid, on her knees, touching her jewelry, so they all came there to report it. With a forced smile she says she sees, while pondering on the look in their eyes, she's seen it before. It's the same look the servants gave her when she first entered House Flores. A bastard with no backing and hated by the mistress, treated worse than the maids. If I'd just come in as a regular maid, maybe it would have been better. Even lowly maids can rise in rank after 10 years of work and gain influence, save up their wages, retire and find a better job, or open a shop. But that kind of future was allowed for her. "I bear the name of Flores, and that name shackled me here forever, treated worse than the servants for over a decade." That's why she can see right through their game. However, she thinks it's kind of hazing, the kind of situation where one can hardly tell if the jewel is really gone or not. Her voice rings sharp as she calls Elda and asks if that isn't her job. "How rude of you, incredibly rude at that. You failed to properly manage your master's jewelry, didn't teach your underlings properly either, and on top of that, you caused a scene outside my door before I was even up. Where did you learn such manners?" "Elda, I'm speaking to you right now." A smile tugs at the end of her lips as she thinks, yes, no one to back her. After all, what does a crown princess married off to a monster prince have to be afraid of? She asks her who assigned her to the palace, and she responds stating it was Countess Elvira's order. Then she announced, "Your insolence is disgracing Countess Elvira's good name." She mentions she must report everything to the Countess, about the rudeness all of them have shown, and immediately, the head maid goes down on her knees, pleading for forgiveness, admitting she was wrong. Her pleas become stronger while Ireia just thinks, mistake, fault, error. She recalls their mockery on the day of her wedding. They say a bride who marries on a rainy day will shed many tears. She faces the reality. In truth, it all began on her wedding day, but even if it's a petty form of revenge, in order to survive in the palace, she must establish order. At this point all the maids join in, pleading for mercy, but instead she turns her back, asking if they're going to keep on making a scene. She warns that she doesn't want to see any more disgraceful behavior, ordering them to leave the place at once without drawing any attention. But then as her eyes locks onto Delphina, the whole commotion replays in her head, Delphina name-dropping the actual person who took the jewelry. Also she notices something strange and questions, Come to think of it, didn't I have a dream like this last night? Am I just imagining things? She doesn't have the time to figure out whether she's just out of her mind or it's really true. She orders a maid to go fetch a guard from outside, ordering the rest of them to remain exactly the way they are. A few minutes later, once the guard arrives, she turns to Sarah and asks what it is that's in her apron pocket. Sarah immediately denies it, but she just orders the guard to check the pocket on her apron. The guard holds her down despite her strong protests. She mentions she hadn't stolen the lady's jewelry, instead it was Delphina, but the knight suddenly pulls out a piece of jewelry from her pocket. Then, with the truth unveiled, she reminds them how they all said it was Delphina who'd stolen the jewelry and asks coldly, so why was the jewelry found in her pocket? Lastly, she declares theft is a serious crime that must be dealt with severely and orders the guard to take them all away for questioning. Delphina thanks Ireia with a bright smile while she dismisses her afterward, only focusing on how if she hadn't noticed the frame-up, she would have been dragged away instead. She returns to the room with a newly confirmed priority. She needs people, not just anyone, but people she can trust in the palace. Caesar's voice calls her back to reality and she immediately turns her attention to him. She asks if he's awake and she softly caresses his cheek. She can only wonder how many unfair situations Caesar must have faced like that until then, and the only way he could respond to hard and trifling circumstances was with aggression. With a calm voice she says she'll change that for him. She thinks they're already bound together by fate, so at least for herself and Caesar, she must surround herself with trustworthy people, but to do that, she needs to speak with the empress. Caesar's nanny arrives. She explains that she was looking for him since he wasn't in his room. She covers her mouth and gasps in shock before mentioning the two of them seem so close. Irene's tries to get him to stop, but the nanny doesn't seem like she's paying attention to that. Rather, she informs her she actually came to deliver a message to the both of them. Revealing that afternoon, she's invited to tea with Her Majesty, the Empress. But to her surprise, Ireia remarks that it's perfect timing since she also has something she wants to speak to the Empress about. Then she drops it like a bomb: she needs to know whether she has the authority to appoint new servants. With that, the nanny discloses that she heard about the commotion earlier and commends her for handling it well, noting those maids were far too unruly. Ireia chimes in. She reveals she was actually taken back and asks if the maids there always behave like that, adding that their attitude toward Caesar also wasn't acceptable either. But the nanny explains that all the staff in the palace serve the Countess Elvira and even act as though they are backed by the Empress's influence, even directly. Glancing at Caesar, she mentions still that doesn't excuse the way they've been treating others. She goes silent, and the next time she speaks, she tells the nanny she has a favor to ask. The nanny gives her the go-ahead and she explains that as she knows that is her current situation, she didn't bring a single maid from her family home, so she has no one she can truly rely on in the palace. Then she asks if she would be able to help her, at least until she can have a lady-in-waiting of her own, and the old lady is instantly filled with joy. A maid suddenly interrupts. She informs Ireia she'll need to be dressed and prepared before lunch, which is before tea time. Confused, she asks if Caesar isn't coming with her, but the nanny explains with a shaky voice that the Empress prefers not to face the first prince directly. Suddenly Caesar's voice rings. "Cornelia." "No." She tilts her head towards him slowly and asks if he really thinks so, and again he says no, this time, his eyes gleaming with murderous intent. Noticing the shift in his reaction, she stares terror as a cruel probability settles in her head. Could it be that the blood I gave him last night is already wearing off? She asks for a moment, disclosing she must talk with him alone. Later, she lays down in bed, pure agitation in her eyes as she thinks, no matter how much she sees that look in his eyes, she can't get used to it. She calls his name, but he doesn't respond. Instead, he brings his head down to her neck, but she says no. She knows they can't leave any marks where they might be seen since she has a meeting with the Empress, so as he traces her smooth skin with the top of his tongue, she tells him not to do it there. As a last resort, she pinches the back of her palm and turns it to him, and as expected, he immediately devours it. Laid down there, her thoughts spiral. Is it really okay to keep letting this happen? I can only hope that I'm not doing something wrong to Caesar in the process. Later, as the maids prepare her for her meeting with the Empress, she orders them to keep everything as simple as possible, thinking they probably already resent her as it is, so it's better not to stand out. However, the real issue remains. She orders a maid to prepare her gloves, and when she asks if she should help her put it on, she says no. She slides her hand into her gloves, thinking it's no secret she injured her hand the previous night and already received treatment. However, if they were to use her wound as an excuse to cause trouble, it'll become a problem. She turns to Caesar and with a smile informs him she'll be right back. However, he seems strongly against it. She tells him there's nothing she can do about it, but without faltering, he remains with his original answer, no. With that, the nanny steps in. She tells him he's putting Ireia in a difficult position and informs him that she'll remain with him until she returns, suggesting he lets her go for now. Ireia turns her back to leave, waving him goodbye, but as he watches her leave, he softly speaks, no. Later, she slumps downward, sweating excessively as she reflects on how they purposely withheld the location from her. The greenhouse furthest from the Malachite Palace of all places. Upon noticing her, a knight scoffs, and from that tiny gesture she draws a conclusion: they must have done that knowing she can't walk properly. She pays her respect to the Empress, bowing so low her hands also touch the ground. As she walks to take her seat, her leg begins to throb and she loses footing, but luckily Delphina catches her. The head maid directs her to the Empress and orders the others to step aside. She takes her seat and immediately the Empress asks how life is going for her in the Imperial Palace, if she is comfortable. However, her voice is unsteady as she reveals there's something she must tell her. She yells that it concerns the first prince, while the Empress, unbothered, simply asks her to go on. Then she reports that she's still unsure whether it is a knight escort or servant, but there are people harming the first prince, Caesar. The Empress repeats, harming him? And she says yes, adding that his body is covered in bruises. She reports that they've even used chains and puzzles to restrain him, but the Empress, with her usual calmness, just says she sees. Then, she turns to take a smoke and afterwards asks, "So, what do you want me to do about it?" She looks at her in shock, unable to say anything, but then, the Empress asks if she didn't hear her the first time. She tries to speak, however the Empress cuts her off. She tells her people must be treated as people only when they are people. Then she drops her question. "What do you think makes someone a person?" Her parrot yells, "A person," and she agrees. She states that a one must act like a person to be called one. Then she turns back to Ireia and asks if she's ever seen the prince act like a person, and she goes silent. She drops her parrot and says a person should walk on 2 feet. Use tools, and speak in the language of the people. Can you tell the difference between the first prince and this bird? She picks up the bird and asks her to take a look. Then she tells her in some way the bird is even better than the first prince, at least I can control this one with my own hand. She lets go of the bird before she continues. But the first prince? He's a beast that can't be controlled. To rein in something that runs wild without reason, naturally a whip is what's needed, don't you think? How else would you deal with such a thing? She speaks up in defense of the prince, however the Empress shuts her up with a new statement: striking a disobedient beast is only natural. Suddenly Ireia snaps. His Highness is not a beast. But only after she says it does she realize the gravity of her action. Lucky for her, instead of getting offended, the Empress simply bursts out into laughter. She commends her afterwards, stating she really does have a hidden talent for comedy, noting that was the best joke she's heard all year. But Ireia doesn't just stay silent. She tells the Empress just as she said the first prince really is different from everyone else. Her mind goes to how he lost his reason and responded to human blood, violently lashing out. His left hand that transformed like a reptile's, and his occasional beast-like eyes, and she acknowledges it was a sight really worthy of being called a curse. But she vows she must remember, that gentle smile and those calm eyes, they were Caesar's too. She tells the Empress the first prince is undoubtedly a person. However, the Empress, unbothered, simply remarks that her concern for her husband is admirable, but then again she tells her, a low-born illegitimate child like herself should cling tightly to even a half-wit husband, right? In that brief moment, her world shatters. The Empress refuses to acknowledge Caesar's position or even his humanity, but not only that, it seems she views her the same way too. She clutches her dress tightly, wondering how she can persuade someone who doesn't even view her as a human. If His Highness behaves like a human, will you acknowledge him? Ireia asks. She declares she'll do it, and asks if Caesar's walks on 2 feet, uses tools and speaks, if that'll be enough, but the Empress still doesn't take her seriously. Rather, she asks her if she believes she can take that beast, but confronting the determination in her eyes, she remarks that it's amusing and finally gives in. Fine, if you can really pull that off, I'll acknowledge it. I'll even pass on the Azure Flame's dream to you. Azure Flame's dream, a necklace said to have been passed down through the imperial women since the founding of the empire. Just as she's about to consider what it'll mean for someone like her to possess it, the Empress speaks. She explains that her wearing it publicly would be the same as her declaring her support for her. She tells her not only would the first prince be acknowledged as human, he would also become the strongest contender for the throne, backed by the imperial family. She goes closer, brushing her hair behind her ear as she asks, "That should be enough recognition for you." Then she gives her until the summer banquet, 3 months from now, to present her human. As she walks away, she adds one more thing. "I despise liars. If you've tricked me with empty words, then as your elder, I'll have to punish you." In a new scene, Delphina helps Ireia back to her quarters when they run into the second prince. He comments that he heard she tamed that lunatic, so he figured she'd be some brawny warrior woman, but she's more ordinary than I expected. He approaches her, calling her name, and she goes pale as she notices the person standing in front of her. She greets the second prince, however. He tells her there's no need for her to be so tense. She pushes his hand away as she points out she never gave him the permission to use her name. "How rude, then shall I call you my sister-in-law instead?" "HM?" he asks. She turns away, stating she'll take her leave if he has no business with her, but he grabs her hand, stopping her in her tracks. Her leg throbs again and she collapses into his arm. As he holds her, he warns her to be careful. She struggles within his grasp, asking him to let go, but instead he does something more unexpected. She asks him what he's doing, but he just tells her he's curious. Does that idiot even know how to have sex with a woman? She pauses to take a look at him, a mix of confusion and terror in her eyes as she asks him what he just said. Instead, he points out the obvious. He mentions it seems like she's having trouble walking and orders someone to bring a litter for her. In a new scene, she throws her pillow in anger. She recalls the second prince's obnoxious question and mumbles softly, "You filthy bastard." She sits angered as she thinks she's never heard such vile words before or suffered such humiliation. Suddenly a familiar voice calls her and she turns to find Caesar. She notices his fit and asks what he's wearing, but he just chuckles softly. She asks if he was under the bed the whole time and how he even got in there, urging him to come up. She notices he's covered in dust, but even more she notices they only cleaned where it appears visible. She plays with his face for a while, then she bursts out laughing. She explains that it's just because he looks so ridiculous right now. "In this splendid palace, I never fit in, the stares and coldness that follow me no matter where I go. Even the Empress and the second prince who look for every opportunity to swallow me whole. I'm in a situation where it feels my neck could get snapped at any moment, yet when I look at Caesar like this, I actually feel free." Still, she tells him they can't leave him that way, and also she reveals she promised to show them a proper person. A few moments later, the nanny appears. Ireia informs her that Caesar needs a bath, however she hesitates. Sending her hesitation, she asks if there's any problem, but she mentions it's nothing and she'll prepare the bath for her. She takes the prince with her while Ireia waves him by as she sits still. Although the nanny's hesitation bothers her a little, she convinces herself nothing will happen over a simple bath, so she'll just wait and see, but a sudden crash draws her attention. She goes to check it out, but her whole face goes red as soon as she spots Caesar standing naked, as if ready to attack. He pushes her down and buries his head in her shoulder for a while and afterwards calls her, shaking. The nanny arrives at that moment. As she places a cloth around him, she mentions bathing him might be a bit too much. Rin, on the other hand, points out in confusion that he hasn't even properly washed himself yet. The nanny confirms her statement, however she explains that there's nothing that can be done as the prince reacts like that just from having water splashed on him. But still, Ireia considers the obvious: if he can't even take a bath, then isn't the rest all too predictable? With that, she asks the nanny to let her try, stating, supporting each other is part of being husband and wife, isn't it? So she'll give it a try. Later, she pushes up her sleeves with pure determination. A male servant notes that he'll begin pouring the water now, but just as he's about to, the prince's voice rings, "No," as he attempts to snatch the bucket away from his hand and ends up injuring him in the process. Angered, the servant curses at him, calling him a bastard, but only when Ireia spots the blood dripping down does she immediately demand for everything to be stopped. She orders all of them to back away and they all leave. The nanny checks up on her and she reassures her that she's okay, bringing up how even with them present they're still rude to the prince, but the nanny's statement leaves her confused. She asks her if she understands it now, that it's impossible to bathe the prince, adding that from what she saw, he hates it that much. She asks if they can escort him back to the room, noting he might actually catch a cold at that rate, however she strongly refuses. She admits she underestimated the situation, however she tells her she can't just give up now, staring he has to finish his bath. The nanny with a perplexed expression states that he clearly doesn't want that, however Ireia counters her statement saying they still need to do it. She asks Caesar to come to her side, but as he walks to her, the nanny, hesitant, asks her what she's doing to do. Then Ireia's lips part dramatically as she notes they have to finish bathing. "I made a promise to the empress that I'd make Caesar human." The nanny, confused, asks her what that's supposed to mean exactly, but instead, Ireia just asks her to understand that Caesar needs that in that moment. With that, Mercedes takes her leave, ignoring Ireia, who keeps calling for her. Seeing how the attendant treated Caesar earlier, Ireia admits she now understands why Mercedes is overprotective. She's been raising him alone in the palace for 10 years, and also, she's the only one there who offered to help her. She glances back at Caesar, who cluelessly. Then she crouches down and asks why he hates bathing. Caesar immediately shakes his head, shouting he hates it, but she can't help but think there must be a reason, at least a part that he hates. She tells him bathing feels nice, it warms one up, refreshes them and makes one smell good, however he just shrugs in disgust. But she isn't about to give up. This time she dips her fingers into the water and asks him to take notice how when one soaks in warm water, their whole body relaxes and it feels so good. She manages to pique his interest a little, but then a realization hits her. "Do you hate being bathed by servants?" That makes sense. The ones who abused him were probably the ones bathing him too. Who knows how roughly they treated him? Ireia ponders, then she tells him if he doesn't want to be bathed by others, he'll have to learn to do it himself. She takes a small amount of water in her hand and he has a small reaction when she pours it on him. But then something comes to her mind. Caesar hadn't reacted at all to the servant's blood earlier. She thought he'd go after any blood, but now she thinks maybe not. She pours the water from a little higher height the next time. Then she turns to him for feedback, asking if this time it didn't feel so bad, but she suddenly pauses. Facing Caesar, who's already wet in front of her, her heart races as she wonders how she didn't think of that. Teaching someone how to bathe means I have to show my own bare skin? Caesar, who notices her sudden pause, calls her, however she quickly cautions him, warning that he can't just toss his clothes like that. He asks if he really can't and she says exactly, noting he has to hold onto the cloth tight so it doesn't come undone, and he agrees. Her thoughts spiral. Even if that's one problem solved, she'll still have to show him how to bathe. She recalls how back then, when they ate together, he didn't take a single bite until did it first. I don't even know anymore, it's for educational purposes, so it should be fine. As she loosens her dress, she asks Caesar to turn around for a while, and once she's done she asks him to turn back around. She grips her gown as she tries to avoid his gaze and also thinks she really doesn't want her legs showing. When she was younger, she was pushed down the stairs by her half-sister. She blamed it on her yelling, that was all her fault as she was being careless and tripped on her own. In House Flores, the servants looked at her like she was some kind of bug. Her half-sister and mother Celestina, who openly bullied her, and her biological father Gasparo, who indulged in banquets and pleasures without caring about anything. Amidst all that, no one came when the accident happened and when she was finally found. It had already been weeks and it was already too late to do anything about it. Now she wonders, what if Caesar thinks I'm dirty too? Her cheeks flush all of a sudden as she shyly asks Caesar not to sniff her dress. Later, she makes sure she has his attention as she goes into the bath. Her legs first, and when she finally relaxes in the warm water, she comments that it feels nice and asks Caesar how it is. She splashes water on him, and as he faces her completely clueless, she bursts out into laughter. She pulls him into the bath asking him not to be that way, and when he's finally seated inside she asks if it's not so bad. You know I like things to be clean, so I'd like Caesar to smell nice too. She pours a bottle of lavender scent into the water and asks him how it smells, and he says it smells good. Soap seeps into her wound, and she flinches from the sudden sting, the sharp jolt of pain drawing Caesar's attention instantly. Lost, her voice shakes as she asks Caesar what is wrong. As he takes her hand, her thought spirals, "Are you trying to drink my blood again?" To her surprise, he places a gentle kiss in between her fingers. She runs her hand through his hair playfully, and he responds with a soft smile, as if expressing his fondness for her. She shows him how to wash carefully, and a few moments later, all that's left is the inside of the town. No matter how she looks at it, she thinks she can't wash something that's private to him and tries to leave, suggesting he can take care of the rest on his own, but he simply looks at her, his expression somber, his former bright eyes now dull. He yells his response afterwards, a loud no, as he tries to stop her from leaving. Anyways guys, watch out for part 2. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and also leave a comment if you'll like a continuation. It is a newly released manhwa, so there might be a little delay in the upload.